The challenge is that a lot of business owners in making that transition, they feel like they are no longer useful in their business until they kind of make that transition. And so they keep coming back to the day to day and they keep fiddling around with the day to day because it makes them feel like they're doing something, right? Even if it's not what they want to be doing.
Yeah. Okay, and welcome to another episode of Business 101 podcast. Today I'm speaking to Stephanie Hayes, who is a business advisor and consultant to established businesses who have, built viable income generating businesses, but still feel kind of stuck and directionless. And Stephanie works with them to kind of transition from an income based business model to a more asset-based business model and prepare for exits. Today, Stephanie will be speaking to us about our experience and expertise in this industry and helping us make sense of, thinking about our businesses in this direction. Welcome to the show, Stephanie. Good to have you here.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you inviting me to talk.
Yes, yes. Thanks for coming on. And I guess let's just start right from the start, right? Let's talk about your entrepreneurship journey. How did you get into entrepreneurship and how did you find your way to this asset-based business model that you speak so frequently about?
It started when I was 12. I grew up in a world where like it never seemed odd to me to have a dream of working for myself. And both my parents were teachers in post-secondary in public sector, and so I don't really know where I got that from, but it's just always sort of natural for me to think about starting up on my own. And I grew up in sort of the technology space, in the technology industry, very early days in software and the Pacific Development Center, and then working in software startups, and then the whole dot-com era. So it was pretty immersed in the entrepreneurial world from kind of the get-go, from day one, coming out of the university and working in some of the startups in the university development center. And so that was just always a very natural and kind of easy place for me. And I really loved how exciting it was. And I loved all the stimulation. And then, being part of the dot com boom and bust was probably the biggest education I've ever had in my career, right? And that was like pretty quick coming out of school for me, was right into the dot-com world. So, I think I learned more in those few years than I've probably learned in my entire education. And so I got really familiar and comfortable in these startup environments and those sort of fast-paced learning environments. And a lot of them didn't make it, right? But you got used to like the funding models. And my first job in those kinds of environments was incubating little businesses for a bigger business, right? They were just funding all of these little incubated startups. And so my job was to make sure that those became operational and, put everything together. And so it's kind of like you got thrown into the wolves, but it was really exciting and it was really fun. And, coming out of that, I ended up working in more in like the consulting world. And so doing more corporate work, big sort of integration projects. But we were always building a business. We were building a consultancy. We were building, our own sort of service-based startups, but we were always consulting into larger organizations, partnering with larger organizations. So it was kind of like the best of both worlds, getting the experience working inside of clients' businesses that were big corporations, but always doing it from inside of a small kind of nimble consultancy. I invested in starting up, a consultancy with my partner. That was my first real business that I owned and, learned a lot there. I built it to a few $1 million in revenue and learned a lot about the service-based business model, how to run it, how to fund it, how to keep a team of service-based consultants who are very high-end engaged and running through the business. Left that business, started up a software company. And then, that software company is still sort of in existence now, and we're actually looking to exit that too. But in that time, I had sort of bounced around as a freelancer and really realized where my heart was in business model design. And I read the Lean Startup, and I got really excited about the idea of the architecture of businesses and how businesses are formed and how a business model looks and operating models. And the consulting work I did at the corporate level was around organizational design and operating models. And so that kind of fit really nicely.
Wow.
Became an entrepreneur mentor at the university sort of accelerator, and just got really into the startup world, but coaching and being a strategist. And then that sort of evolved into working with small business owners and, female business owners who were independent sort of solo business owners and creating these service-based businesses. And I remember one day, maybe 5 years ago, sitting in a retreat down in Texas. I was working with my client down there. And I was kind of looking at this wall of where I had put all the things I'd ever done and all of the things I had built in my life and all the skills and the experience. And I'm one of those people who just tries everything and does everything and learns everything. And I was kind of looking at it, I'm like, what am I building? Like, what am I actually building and creating? And it got me thinking about real estate investments and how could I emulate that same kind of creation of an asset, but using my business skills. And I got really interested in the idea of buying, renovating, and selling businesses and how a business can become an asset and can grow in value. And here we were as service-based business owners, always thinking about revenue and clients and how we get the next client. And it felt very hamster wheelie, right? And I thought, man, all of these, if I know this much about assets, why are we not actually focused on creating those inside our business? And then it sort of evolved into getting very familiar with exit strategies. And if I know what my exit strategy is, why am I not building a growth plan based on what I eventually want to exit with? And why am I not building things inside my business that are ultimately going to contribute to my valuation down the road? And so this thinking really sort of changed my perspective on everything. And then I started talking about it with my community and with my clients, and it all like resonated with them. And what I learned is that you can sell any business, right? Like you don't have to have a huge, you know, Silicon Valley startup for it to be something that sells. I've bought businesses for $500. Like there's a market for kind of everything. And even if your exit isn't about selling your business, but rather taking yourself out of the business, all those things are really viable. But why are we not looking at that and thinking about, the near term strategies in the context of what we want to build in the longer term? So that sort of evolved, and I became much more focused on creating those exit roadmaps and asset based business models for my clients. And where we're at today is we're actually looking at starting up a private equity fund and really like throwing some fuel on the fire of getting to this dream of buying, renovating, selling businesses and helping small business owners exit their business in the long term. So we're not talking like, if I have somebody come to me and say, I need to sell right now, great. I've got the partners and the resources and the ability to get you there. But a lot of people are they come to the conversation of selling, but what they really want to do is they're not ready to sell right now. They're just unhappy with their business, or they're just not sure what to do next and they're frustrated. So some of them will want to sell maybe, but 5 years down the road. And so we'll work with them on building a growth strategy that adds to the valuation of their business. And some of them don't actually want to sell. What they want to do is they want to change their role inside their business, or they need a new business model, or they really want to like shift. And so we'll work with them on that. So like across that spectrum, that's kind of what we're building now. And I'm working with a partner on that. So it's been really pretty exciting, and it feels like the right place to be in, but it took that evolution to kind of get here.
Wow, already sounds exciting. And I was just curious, are you more so in you spoke about helping them to build the business strategy or the growth strategy that leads up to the kind of valuation they're looking for? Do you also help businesses to find, for example, potential buyers if they are looking to sell, say, 5 years down the line, or do you kind of hands off around, once you get them to the valuation they're looking at, then they have to go figure out selling and exiting?
What we will do with the people who want to sell is that we have a series of partners that we can have them work with in terms of the actual transactional part of a sale. So, business brokers and PE funds and other partners that can help them find a buyer. But what we'll do with them if they're in that place is actually work with them on mentorship and advisory around helping them get through that sale, because that's a really hard thing for a business owner to get through. Like, there's the emotional side of it, there's the strategy side of it. And so we'll be there to represent them and to help them through that process. But we'll work with partners who go out and find the sellers. Sometimes we already have connections to buyers. And I think as we continue to grow this side of the business, we'll probably have a lot more of that. But we're much more focused on the strategy and the advisory and helping them get to the ultimate end goal that they want, whether that's a sale or whether that's, to build value over the long term, or whether that's just a shift in their business model, a new role for them, or, eventually an operational exit where they still retain ownership, but they take themselves out of the business. So there's, a number of different paths, but we're there to kind of help them figure out where they're going and also how they're going to get there and support them along the way.
Got it. Got it. And Stephanie, you kind of already started down a path that I want to go a bit, further down on. You spoke about, shifting from income to wealth and how you found that or how you did that shift for yourself, right? I'm trying to figure out, why do you think, you work a lot with business owners. What are the common reasons that you find why people seem to be all super focused on income and only start thinking about exiting further down the line? What are some of the common reasons you find for that?
They just don't know enough about it, right? They don't know that it's an option for them. It's a very inaccessible thing for them. And so part of what I've built is a community called Assets to Exits, where I want to make exiting and valuation and understanding that whole world much more accessible for small business owners. But most people just don't even think it's an option for them. And that's what I want to change, is to help them understand that not every business is going to sell for 5 times multiples, but you certainly have assets in your business even right now, even if you don't think that you do. So we're not going to get away from, I'm not saying don't make income, right? That's a necessary part of your business.
Yeah.
But if you just shift your focus to understanding that you want to be focused on value as opposed to income, then you start to make different decisions in your business around your strategy, and you start to look at things in a different way. And it feels much more like there's a purpose behind your business, as opposed to this frustration of always, always trying to seek out the next client, right? So it
Wow.
really lets people sort of lean into their business and settle into something that feels a lot has a lot more longevity.
And what would you say is the difference between income and wealth in businesses? And why is that mental shift, that mentality shift from focusing on income generation to building wealth and focusing on assets? Why is that important for especially solo business people and first time young founders?
Mm. Income, you can have lots of income and no wealth, right? You could have lots of income and no value in the business. I know lots of people who have built these, impressive 7-figure businesses, but they keep 10% of it. I would much rather have a $300,000 business where I'm keeping 80% of that than, a $1.2 million
Exactly.
business and I'm keeping 100,000, right? So that's just to define the fact that income doesn't necessarily mean wealth, right? It doesn't mean you're keeping it. So income certainly contributes to wealth for sure. But what the mindset shift is that I am building something that's going to get more valuable in time, and I'm working towards something. And so I make different decisions, and I feel like there's a purpose behind my business. And I feel like, there's something that I'm really striving towards, and I understand where I'm going. I think part of the reason people experience what they call burnout is that they don't have that purpose, or they don't have that longer term vision. They just get caught up in this, am I just going to do this forever? And then when I get too tired to go looking for new clients, I just shut it all down. That feels very defeating. And so when we can shift the focus to what can I build inside my business that's going to create longer term value for me, I'm still going to get income. I'm still looking for income. I'm still getting, revenue inside my business. But now I've got something else that feels like a longer term plan. And that feels like my business is actually a thing, not just an income vehicle, right?
Yeah. One of the things you kind of already touched on is entrepreneurship through acquisition. You didn't use the term, but you're already speaking in that direction. From my conversations with people, one of the things I've found is some people they feel very essential to their businesses, and they just don't see themselves ever leaving the business. They feel like the business is gonna crumble if they were to leave, right? So they can't really think in that selling the business angle. What are some of the tips that you have for kind of stepping back from your business and building a more autonomous business?
That really we do a lot of work with founders that when we start with them, that's where they're at. And they don't like it. They don't like that their business is so dependent on them, but they just can't see another way. And that's our job, is to try and figure out like how does your role change inside your business if you want this longer term outcome? And so what we have to do is, the most important thing is to define what they want, right? Define what that vision is. And I've heard this so many times of a founder say, well, I know what the vision is, but I'm just not getting there, like, because I keep getting stuck in this day to day. And so the work that we do is about getting them out of the day to day and getting them into a new role inside their business and figuring out what that transition looks like. And when they can finally just accept that and lean into it, then what happens is their shift in their role actually usually ends up benefiting the business. The person this is all about alignment, right? I need my role to be in alignment with who I am as a powerful person. And if I am as a powerful person is to be on stage and speaking, if I'm constantly managing my day to day, I'm not getting out there and speaking. And that's what's going to draw people into my business. And so if I'm not doing that, I'm not getting progress. I'm not moving forward, but
Yeah,
I'm also not doing something that's like really aligned with my power inside my business. The challenge is that a lot of business owners, in making that transition, they feel like they are no longer useful in their business until they kind of make that transition. And so they keep coming back to the day to day, and they keep fiddling around with the day to day because it makes them feel like they're doing something, right? Even if it's not what they want to be doing.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Wow, that's very profound. Stephanie, you said any business can be sold. So can I sell my podcast? And what's my valuation?
Yes. Oh, I don't know what your valuation. I don't know enough about your business, but yes, theoretically, yes, you could. You can sell a podcast. You can sell an event that you do every year, right? Like, all of these things are assets. I've got a uh, little freebie on my website, which is all the 9 different types of assets that you can build inside your business. But a podcast is essentially a product, right? And so if you put the time and energy into thinking about it that way, then you're going to do things inside your podcast that benefit it eventually being something that you sell, right? So that's the really interesting part about all these things that we're creating, is that there's value in them.
Amazing, amazing. And Stephanie, I assume you're going to give me the links for, these freebies on your website so that people can also go and take advantage
Yes,
of that.
absolutely.
But you kind of already started talking on valuation, and let's drill down that hole a bit more, right? I know that valuation is a whole business on its own, and there are people who do this for a living, but what are some of the most common little tweaks that you've seen people make in, the business models that can significantly increase valuation?
Well, I'm going to answer this question by telling you why valuation is important for you to do long before you ever think about selling. Because if I'm going to have 5 years to work on my business, why wouldn't I work on the things that are going to make it more valuable? So if I do a valuation now, I can see where are the gaps that are affecting my valuation. Where are the things that are risks inside my business that are going to bring my valuation down? Because no valuation is about, just putting numbers on a spreadsheet and then there's your valuation. You're going to start with that, and then you're going to do a whole like qualitative risk assessment on the business. And sometimes there's like 120 questions that you would ask that would affect your valuation. So any buyer is going to come in and is going to assess those kinds of things, and they're going to come up with a valuation number based on the sort of qualitative metrics. So if I know after doing my valuation that my valuation is being brought down because I have risk around diversification of my sales channels, or I have risk around, my systems and operations, well, I can spend the next 5 years making sure that those change and that those are better, so that ultimately a valuation is going to be, sometimes it can be twice, right? It can be double what you started with. So why would you not build a growth strategy based on your valuation and where you can improve your valuation? Because it's not always just about the money.
Well, yes, yes. And that's really good advice. And kind of just one question in that direction, right? How does a new founder incorporate that kind of thinking into like their business strategy or their growth strategy?
By being really familiar with what valuation looks like, right? It's not a secret that when
Yeah,
a buyer is going to do valuation, they're going to look at all of these different pieces of the business and sort of, increase their valuation or decrease their valuation based on, what
yeah.
they learn about it. So if you know those things, you can be very conscious about your business model design from the get-go. Now, the caution I would say is like, as a startup founder, you're gonna have to go and like make a mess for a while, right? You're gonna have to go and try some things out. And that's what's gonna help you build a business that's gonna be successful. So I say don't get too caught up right from the get-go on, trying to build this perfect business, because if it's not aligned with who you are, if it doesn't have any of that, that's your sort of special sauce in it, then it really isn't gonna be all that unique or all that successful. So spend that first kind of bit feeling into what this business is and trying a few things and figuring out what your real strength is. And then, then when you've sort of settled into that, then start thinking about, okay, now that I know what I want to do, how am I going to chart a path forward so that it becomes as valuable as possible to a buyer in, 5, 7 years?
Oh, that's really good advice. And I like what you said about, doing evaluation of valuing your business way before you actually want to sell. Because then you can tweak your business strategy in the way that you're putting your efforts and your most significant assets and resources in the direction of the part of the business that would actually influence valuation when you want to sell. I know that some of these concepts feel more familiar when people hear personal anecdotes and things like that. Do you have any experience that you're willing to share around a business that you supported in this direction? Maybe they weren't thinking about selling, and by thinking in this direction of, assets instead of income, they were able to increase their valuation and get a better exit.
Absolutely. I would say I had a client who had a like an early seven figures business, from an income perspective. And she was like, okay, let's try and sell in 3 years. So when we did a valuation on her business, we just used SDE, and SDE is very much about like what the owner is currently getting. But then when we did the rest of the valuation and the risk adjustment, you know, she had very, very little diversification in terms of her revenue channels, in terms of her
Wow.
customers. She had a great little business and it would have probably sold for, 1.6 or something like that. Um, Maybe 1.8. And so when we looked at the things that were negatively affecting her valuation, we want to build more diversification, because a risk is that she's only got one channel of revenue, and another risk is that she's entirely dependent on ads, and another risk is that she's only serving one very narrowly defined customer, right? So any one of those are a failure point in the business. So we worked to and then like that affects her profitability too, because it's all ad revenue.
Yeah.
So we developed a new business model or a new strategy that would give her marketing channels that weren't ad dependent and didn't cost her any money. So partnerships, collaborations, like she had a lot of sort of clout in her space. And so she took advantage of that in her relationships to start building some of these partnerships and some of these collaborations, which would introduce new audiences to her. But also, and it would give her, marketing strategies that didn't cost her money. So it would increase her profitability. And then in terms of diversification, we launched a new product for her that was focused on a different market, because she had a very narrowly defined client base, which is good. Like it's a good tidy little business. But if she wants to improve that valuation, we wanted to give her another market segment that she could, and of course we also had another product that she could sell. So she didn't have all her revenue dependent on this one product that she was selling. What else did we do with her? Anyway, so if those continue to grow over the next sort of 3 years, she has the potential to increase her valuation to like 2.4, right? So it works, right? And it works if you understand what a buyer's looking for and what a buyer is going to discount from a business when they're buying. Oh, and to your point, there's a whole community around investorpreneurs, right? These are the people who get into entrepreneurship by buying as opposed to building from scratch. Super
Yes.
smart idea. If you read Walker Dibel's book or Cody Sanchez, like any of those guys are really promoting that, and it's super smart. And you get to know the buy side as well, right? So when you get to know the buy side and what buyers are looking for, this model that we're developing right now, we're going to be both on the buy and the sell side. So that's, super exciting. So knowing all of that, all of those different perspectives can help you, structure a growth strategy for a business that is, that makes a lot of sense.
Yes, yes. And you always kind of speak in the direction of my next question, which is great, right? I was just actually going to ask that we speak a bit from the buyer perspective, been talking from the seller perspective, but there are a few listeners who are like, I actually want to get into business, the world of building a business, but I don't want to start from scratch. So maybe this ETA is the route I want to go, right? What are some of the things they should look out for when trying to buy a business? And what are some of the, I would say, easy pitfalls that people seem to ignore?
So you really have to do your due diligence. And, I like Cody Sanchez's idea of buying boring businesses. They're like, look for historical performance, right? You want to look for consistency across, a pretty decent time horizon. Now, small businesses are super great to buy, right? Like there's a big market for small businesses, but you want to look for that consistency and that like over time that there's an established kind of a little engine inside the business. I have bought a business that was basically dying. So it is a strategy to take on a business that is on its last legs, but it definitely takes like a bit more strategy, and I
Yeah.
wouldn't recommend that for a first time buyer. But also align your purchases to a business that you know or an industry that you know where you're going to feel comfortable, at least in the beginning, um, being able to direct this, the growth strategy and don't go in there and try to make a whole bunch of changes right from the get-go. Like just get in there and get the feel for the business, let it operate, get to know the people, get to know the industry, and then make your decisions around renovations once you've had some time under your belt. Like the worst sort of leaders are the ones who come in and try to deep six everything right from the beginning, right? You don't know enough about the business and you don't, other than the spreadsheets you've
Yeah.
kind of looked at. So, definitely spend some time, but read Walker Deibel's book called Buy Then Build. I think it's one of the best ones out there in terms of understanding all of the opportunities that you have as a buyer and how you can leverage yourself with, funding and all of that sort of thing. So you can, make better use of debt and make better use of options that are out there for you for as a buyer.
Good advice. Thanks for sharing resources as well. I know that you work with both large companies and small companies, right? Are there any principles, obviously, aside identifying risk and working to diversify those risks? Are there any other principles in terms of value creation that you've seen, carry across all types on sizes of businesses?
Well, it really comes down to understanding what's valuable to the market, right? And at the end of the day, value means that I can exchange some money for something, right? And so you want to understand the world that you operate in because one value strategy for one organization is going to be really different than a value strategy for another organization. So know your market and know your business, and choose your asset strategy based on that, but also based on who you are, right? Some people are going to look at certain types of assets. They're like, that's never going to be me, right? I'm never going to want to build a community. Never going to want to build a membership or something like that of engaged community members. That's just not me. But maybe I'm, really good at building intellectual property. And so that becomes a valued asset inside my business. So know yourself and know the market that you're in before you make decisions around what you're going to create inside the business.
It sounds like you're saying that especially for young business owners, new founders, it's better to play in an industry where you're at least comfortable, right? Where you know your way around, you can make connections. And do you think that's a valuable
Yeah,
asset?
I think so. And that just seems to happen naturally, right? My first business was a technology business in the technology industry, and that's what I knew. So, that's where I started from. I'm at the point now where I would be really excited to buy any type of business because I'm pretty confident in all of the different pieces of business that I could learn a new industry pretty quickly and learn a new business model pretty quickly. But, I think if this is your first foray, don't make it harder on yourself by trying to get into some, buying a laundromat or something. If you grew up as a zookeeper, right? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
find something that's aligned with with your, where you're familiar with first, and then you can expand once you have some time under your belt. And by the way, acquisition is a really viable growth strategy too. Like, rather than just having to buy more businesses or sell your business, you can grow by acquisition, and that becomes really, really interesting as well.
Exciting, exciting. Let's talk now about some of the things that you're doing. Currently trying to sell your tech business, which you've had for
Yeah,
14 years.
yeah, we have a software company and it's what's that?
Right. So you're buying other businesses, you're trying to sell your business. What does it feel like being on either side of the transaction? What are some of the lessons that you've learned?
All the lessons that I've learned. Do we have another 2 hours?
Uh,
I think it's really valuable for me because I have worked with other business owners on selling their businesses, and I've been on the negotiating table and that sort of thing. But now that we're trying to sell our own, it's pretty interesting, right? And what it really sort of brings home for me is just how different all these businesses are and how much nuance there is. And we have a software company, but it's not a typical, SaaS product. It's also not like a standalone product. And so we have this kind of interesting business model. Both my partners are kind of retiring out. I'm turning 50 in a couple of weeks and they're ahead of me a couple of years. And so, it's gotten to the point where we're like, okay, if we wanted to grow, we would have to take on money, and none of us are in the position where we really want to do that right now. And so now's the time to start investigating whether we can hand this off to somebody. And it was a good, like, first foray into building something. And it's 14 years old. It's, been around for a while. We've got, established, consistent clients. And so it's going to be interesting to see where that goes. And so we're in the process of the M&A assessment right now. Um, on the buy side, I bought a business a couple of years ago, and that was, a great way to really get my hands dirty. And I've built businesses from the beginning too. So, I understand all of these different pieces, but the buying side was pretty interesting. We did vendor-based financing, and so that makes it a different kind of acquisition than if I was acquiring via, a fund. And then now what we're doing is we're actually going to build the fund and get investors inside the fund, and then we become responsible for
Then,
sourcing and renovating those businesses on behalf of the investors inside our fund.
okay, got it. Thanks for sharing. So one of the things that I've heard a lot of people say is, I can only focus on one thing at a time. I'm either trying to build the business or I'm trying to sell it. Is there a middle ground, and how does one strike that balance?
So this is why I say, like, start thinking about your exit way, way in advance of actually wanting to do it. And I mean, like, years in advance, because by the time you get ready, by the time you're ready to actually go through the sale, you have prepared and you understand, and it's, a sale is always going to be a new thing, right? It's always going to be a new activity. It's always going to be stressful. It's always going to be whatever. But if you can get yourself prepared and you understand what you've done to create value, like, you go into a sale far more informed and ready, and there aren't as many surprises if you start early. So I would say at any point in your business is a good time to start thinking about what your longer term exit strategy is.
And if you were to go back and start your first company all over again, right? Would you start it when you started? Are there any things you would do differently? Obviously, you learned pretty quickly about, thinking about exit and things like that. But are there any other thing you feel like, if I could go back, I'll probably do something different?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I'm a huge fan of learning through doing, and I invested a lot of money in that business, and it's actually still going. It was sold to someone else after I had left. And if had I known back then what I know now, I would have made some very different decisions. I didn't know a lot about business models. I didn't know a lot about financing. I didn't know a lot about, but you learn all of this by doing. You learn all of this by not being scared to go through the difficult processes. And I lost some money, for sure I did. Not much, like, it was okay. But, I think it's more about just, the money that you make or the money that you lose. But what did I take out of that, and how would I apply that to my clients' businesses and all of that? So whether or not I had a successful exit matters very little as to what I can help other people do, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I guess my final question would be, for anyone who's just starting out, right? What is that one piece of overarching advice you'd have about, keeping the end in mind, thinking about living right before you start? Like, what is that one advice you would give?
know yourself as a business owner first, right? Understand what motivates you, understand what you want, understand like whether it's the short term, the long term, and have a personal plan. Because when you build your business, you have to build it in a way that is aligned with what your end goal is or what you want from your business on an ongoing basis, and that's what's going to make it successful. But if you're, if I'm a zookeeper and I'm trying to build a technology hardware business, and I don't really like it, it's I'm not gonna be that successful, right? So always knowing yourself and always knowing what, motivates you is such a huge important part of anybody's business. And it's actually the first thing I do with all of my clients is I take them back to that, no matter what stage they're at.
Yeah, and this was supposed to be my last question, but I just thought about something now, right? I spoke to someone earlier, and they had started a business that they had to sell because they had issues with their partner,
Hmm.
and they were disagreeing on strategy, essentially, right? Have you experienced things like that where because people didn't think about this exit. They didn't have this exit, I guess, this exit goal in mind. They kind of made the wrong decision in terms of partners, and the business suffered as a result of that. And how would you advise people to then incorporate this thinking into selecting to partner with what industries to serve, all of that?
Yeah, partnership is a really big topic, and it's one of the most difficult pieces of going into business because a lot of people go into business together and they think, rainbows and unicorns, and they don't define enough about their relationship. About it's like going in. It's kind of like getting married, right? Like there's not a prenup is not such a bad thing, right? But if you can get into a relationship with a partner and you define how you're going to deal with things when they get difficult, what you both want, what that exit is going to look like, what you're working towards, like all of that, you sort of eliminate a lot of the problems that are going to come. I've seen some very, very nasty, very difficult
Makes sense.
dissolutions of partnerships that have, really caused people some heartache. So I would say, first of all, be really, really clear that this is somebody that you want to go into business with. And then, second of all, define all of those terms like a prenup before you even get into business together, because then you at least have a frame of reference, and you need to maintain that relationship just like a marriage, right? You need to constantly check in with each other and do periodic check-ins to make sure that your strategy is where you both want to go, and you're just going to avoid a lot of heartache down the road.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for coming on and for sharing so much about your experience and expertise in this industry.
Yeah.
Yeah, look
Thanks
forward.
for having me on. It was a good
Yeah,
talk.
yeah, thank you, Stephanie, and I'll see you guys in another episode of the Business 101.